All right, so let's get right into it. We're heading back to 1946, to this little slice of water tucked between Albania and the Greek island of Corfu. What went down here? Well, it turned into the very first case the brand new International Court of Justice ever had to deal with. And believe me, it was a dramatic, deadly affair that ended up creating legal rules that are still a huge deal today. And the cost of what happens? Well, it was brutal. 44 British sailors lost their lives, and dozens more were seriously hurt. This was supposed to be a routine peacetime trip, and in a flash, it blew up into a massive international crisis. Now, this whole tragedy, it didn't just happen out of the blue. It was really the boiling point after months of things getting more and more tense. So back in May of '46, Albanian guns actually fired on a couple of British ships. Fast forward 5 months to October 22nd, and bam! 2 British destroyers hit mines right in that same channel. And then, just a few weeks later, the Royal Navy comes back to sweep for those mines. A decision that, as you'll see, became a huge legal headache all on its own. So to really get our heads around this case, we're going to walk through it just like the court did. First, we'll look at the disaster itself. Then, we'll tackle the big question of Albania's responsibility. After that, we'll dig into the trail of evidence and then flip to the other side. Did Britain go too far? And finally, we'll see how it all came together in the court's landmark judgment. Okay, let's set the scene. It's October 22nd, 1946. You've got this squadron of 4 Royal Navy warships sailing up the Corfu Channel. Now, this was supposed to be a safe route. It had been swept for mines before. But then, out of nowhere, an explosion rocks the destroyer HMS Saumarez. It hit a mine. Catastrophic damage. So another ship, the HMS Volage, moves in to help to try and tow it to safety, and then it hits a mine too. Incredibly, both ships were still afloat, but they were torn apart, just barely managing to limp back to port. Well, the United Kingdom was absolutely convinced that Albania was behind this. The whole mess gets kicked up to the United Nations, and the UN basically says, look, you two should take this to the new International Court of Justice. And surprisingly, both countries agreed. They actually signed a special agreement to let this brand new world court have the final say. And just like that, the court had its very first big, messy case on its hands. And really, the whole thing boiled down to 2 massive questions for the court. First, was Albania legally on the hook for those explosions, for the deaths and the damage? And second, did the United Kingdom cross a line? Did their navy violate Albania's sovereignty, either when the ships were first hit or when they came back to sweep for mines? So let's tackle that first question about Albania's responsibility. This is where it gets really interesting, because it's basically a huge piece of legal detective work. See, the UK had a problem. They had no direct proof, no witness who could say, I saw Albania laying those mines. So the court faced this giant challenge. How in the world do you prove a country is guilty when you don't have a smoking gun? So the UK came at it from a few different angles. Their first argument was pretty direct. Albania laid the mines. The second theory, okay, maybe Albania didn't do it alone, maybe they got their ally, Yugoslavia, to help. But the court looked at both of those claims and said, basically, we just don't see enough evidence here. That meant everything. The entire case came down to the third accusation, that Albania knew about the mines and just didn't bother to warn anybody. And that right there is the million-dollar legal question, isn't it? How do you prove what a government knew? I mean, knowledge isn't something you can hold in your hand. It's inside people's heads. So how could anyone, let alone a court, prove what was going on secretly inside the Albanian government? Getting direct proof was pretty much impossible. So to get around this problem, the court pulled out this really powerful legal tool, indirect evidence. You probably know it as circumstantial evidence. The thinking goes like this. A country has total control over its own land and water, right? That makes it super hard for anyone else to get concrete proof of what they're up to. So the court said, okay, if we can't get direct proof, we're going to allow for a chain of logical conclusions based on the facts we do have. And the court didn't hide this either. They were very upfront about their approach. They literally said their job was to figure out if they could establish Albania's knowledge using this indirect evidence. And let me tell you, that decision was a total game changer for international law. So, what was this chain of evidence? Well, first piece of the puzzle, Albania itself had publicly stated that it kept its waters under a close watch. Okay. Second, you just have to look at a map. The channel is super narrow and it's lined with Albanian lookout posts. The idea that someone could spend a couple of hours laying mines there without being seen, it just doesn't add up. And the final nail in the coffin? The court sent its own experts to the spot, and they came back and said, yeah, any lookout doing their job must have noticed this happening.
And there it was. The chain of circumstantial evidence was locked tight. So based on all of this, the court came to its incredible conclusion. They admitted they couldn't prove who actually planted the mines. But, they said, the whole operation could not have been accomplished without the knowledge of the Albanian government. Bottom line, in the eyes of the court, Albania knew.
But wait, that was only half the battle, because now the court had to pivot and look at Albania's side of the story, their counterclaim. The question now was, did the mighty British Royal Navy act illegally? Did they violate Albania's sovereignty? And this really broke down into two separate incidents. The initial ship passage on October 22nd and that minesweeping operation a few weeks later. All right, so let's look at the first incident, the passage on October 22nd when the ships were hit. On this point, the court actually sided with the UK. It ruled that the Corfu Channel is an international strait, which means that in peacetime, warships have a right of innocent passage. They don't need to ask for permission. So even if Britain was kind of poking the bear to see how Albania would react, the act of sailing through wasn't by itself illegal.
That minesweeping operation in November, though, that was a whole different ballgame. Remember, after the explosions, the UK sent this huge naval force back into Albanian waters, without asking, of course, to clear out the mines and collect evidence. The UK argued this was a vital mission to, and this is the legal term, secure the corpora delicti, basically to preserve the evidence of the crime. Albania, on the other hand, saw it as a straight-up, deliberate invasion of its territory.
And on this point, the court did not mince words. It completely shot down the UK's justification. In this really powerful statement that people still quote today, the court said that this so-called right of intervention was really just a manifestation of a policy of force. In other words, it was bullying, and it has absolutely no place in international law. And so, after all the arguments, all the evidence, we finally get to the court's landmark judgment. And what's so fascinating is how incredibly balanced it was. It was a nuanced verdict that probably didn't make either country completely happy, but it ended up shaping the rules of international law for generations.
So, let's look at the final scorecard. Issue number 1. Was Albania responsible for the mines? The verdict? Yes, it was responsible because it failed to warn other ships. Issue number 2. Was the UK's initial passage a violation? Verdict? No, that was a lawful act of innocent passage. But, issue number 3. Was the UK's minesweeping operation a violation? Verdict. Yes, that was a clear violation of Albania's sovereignty. So, in the end, it was kind of a draw. Both sides won a little, and both sides lost a little.
But really the biggest, most lasting thing to come out of this whole mess is what we now call the Corfu Channel Principle. And it's a really fundamental idea. It says that every single country has a duty not to let its territory be used, knowingly, for acts that hurt other countries. This concept of state responsibility, that you're responsible for what happens on your turf, it was basically born right here, in this case, and it's an absolute cornerstone of international law today.
And in the end, the Corfu Channel case leaves us with this huge, lingering question. One that's just as relevant now as it was back then. When a country is attacked, when its people are harmed, where do you draw that incredibly fine line between its right to find evidence and seek justice and the risk of violating international law itself?